As you know, this webinar is called Why Did I Do That? So we want to start off by focusing on that question. So if you can, feel free to take a second, get settled, try to reduce any distractions around you. And what I want you to do is think about a time recently when you asked yourself that exact question. Why did I do that? Or even if you ask yourself, why did I not do that? Maybe you neglected to do something. And as you're thinking about this, again, kind of focusing in on that question, picturing that time in your mind where you asked yourself that question, what I want you to do is notice what you're feeling. So in particular, as I ask that, what are you feeling in your body? So some people report kind of tension in their chest, maybe in their stomach, maybe in your throat, you're feeling something. And as you think about that feeling, what do you tend to associate with it? What emotions do you associate with it? You might be feeling some regret, maybe some anger, maybe some embarrassment. And along with those feelings, also think about the thoughts that are coming up for you right now. Right? So what are you thinking about yourself? What are you thinking about maybe another person involved in this scenario, right? And if you're able, maybe you might be able to think about another time where you felt a similar way, maybe where you had this kind of similar experience, maybe similar thoughts about yourself, similar feelings, maybe even a time where you behaved really similarly. All right, so you can now turn your focus back to this webinar. I appreciate your willingness to do that with me, by the way. So now we've got in our mind these moments of times in which we behaved in ways that led to regret. And the truth is that we all have moments like that, right? So times where we feel out of control, where we're frustrated with ourselves and really not sure how to change. And many of us, of course, experience patterns of behavior that are distressing to us. And not only that, but we also experience times in which we feel really burdened by the difficult behaviors of others, right? So we just deconstructed this time in which you asked yourself, why did I do that? But I imagine we could just as easily consider times where you asked yourself, why did they do that, right? So there are many ways to understand these kinds of behaviors, but attachment is one really great way to think about the behaviors that are kind of perpetual and perplexing to us that we can't really seem to shake. So you might be wondering, what is attachment? So attachment refers to the emotional bonds that we have to others in order to promote a sense of safety. And this is based on our earliest relationships in life to our caregivers. So within these relationships, we develop these working models, these stories of what it means to be safe, just based on how available our attachment figures are to us and our interactions with them. So as for the theory of attachment, this was originated with the work of John Bowlby. He theorized this biological instincts in humans that encourages proximity seeking to an attachment figure. So what that means is that in order to increase our chance for survival, we innately seek closeness to someone who can protect us. And as kids, that's our caregivers, our parents, guardians, whoever it is who's caring for you. And when we're talking about attachment, it's really important to remember that it's not the same as love or affection. So those can be indicators of a secure attachment, but instead, what we're really talking about is that bond at its most basic level that's really meant to keep us safe. And attachment, by the way, has a really robust research base. So what we're talking about today is backed by a lot of science, which is excellent. And one of the most famous studies on attachment was done by Mary Ainsworth, and that was called the Strange Situation Protocol. And in this study, scientists observed interactions between infants and their caregivers, and what they wanted to understand better was how the quality of these relationships impacted a child's response to a new and potentially distressing situation. So we actually have a short video that will demonstrate a version of this experiment and some of the findings that were developed by the researchers. So we'll throw to that now.
This experiment, which I watched through a two-way mirror, is designed to gauge how secure is the crucial relationship between mother and child.
this bunny is going to go here, and that bunny will be on top.
The value of the test has been established in studies that would watch a child, 1-year-old, and then follow it up and interview them about their relationships to their parents when they were 21 years old. So we're quite confident in the long-term significance of this relationship.
Peter, that's Peter.
After several minutes' play, the mother is signaled to leave the room.
Sweetie, I'll be back in 1 minute, okay? I'll get you back in 1 minute.
It's upsetting for you. Shame, I feel. But she'll survive. The key moment in the experiment is the child's reaction to her mother's return.
Hi. Hi. It's okay.
The important clue is whether the baby's able to become calmed down by the contact with the mother and get back to play. Sometimes it takes a couple of minutes. But you see, when the mother was out, she was only interested in the mother, no interest in the toys. Now she has a contact with the mother. She's beginning to show a little interest in the environment, and shortly she'll be right back with the toys where we started.
So you would call this a secure one?
Yes, yes.
She's certainly much happier.
Goes to the door following her. Now, we sent the mother right back in, but the point here is not to distress the baby. We're just trying to challenge it. The baby puts her hands to her face in a sad expression, puts her face down. When she picks her up, she keeps her head down, her arms out, and then she sits in the chair holding the baby. The baby's still sullen. He's low-keyed.
So you would call this insecure
Yes,
attachment?
insecure. He's avoidant. He's not engaging her, and it's not the reunion's not effective. And it's important to remember here that the thing that upset him was her absence. Her return should be the solution to his problem. Now this is another pattern that we see in babies who are not good at using their mother as a secure base at home. This baby is also insecure. But you'll see, we got a look at his play before the separation. The mother's left, and when she returns, she picks him up. He can't calm down. He's still upset. She offers a toy to amuse him or to comfort him or to distract him, and he slaps it away. She offers another. He slaps it away. He's angry. We call these babies resistant or ambivalent because they both want her back and yet can't use the contact. We think that the difficulty is that in the past, when he sought comfort, she's been inconsistent as to whether she's available and responsive or not.
So what's great about the Strange Situation Protocol is that it was a longitudinal study, which means that they actually checked back in with the participants over time. So this provided some really striking revelatory data, right, for how these relationships impact functioning later on. Within the Strange Situation Protocol, they identified these two broad classifications of attachment, secure and insecure. And they also identified 4 different attachment styles. So I'm going to go over some of these terms right now. You just watched some of them in the video, right? So we have secure and insecure attachment, and within insecure attachment, we have anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, and disorganized attachment. And by the way, if you do research on your own after watching this webinar, you'll likely encounter all sorts of different terms used to describe kind of the same thing when it comes to these different classifications of attachment styles. And I've listed some of them here, so you will kind of know what you're reading if you end up doing some research afterwards. But today, we're just going to be using the terms that I've listed here in bold. So secure, insecure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized. And one thing that you might notice is that a lot of these words used to describe attachment styles may at first sound kind of disparaging. So, within our language, words like anxious, avoidant, disorganized, even the word insecure we might have some negative associations with those terms. And so what we want to do is sort of take the charge out of those words, because the truth is that there is no bad attachment style. Attachment styles are really just adaptations to parenting styles. So knowing all of that, what I would love for you to do is think about right now, as we're going through the different kinds of attachment styles, which of them are resonating with you, right? Which ones remind you of other people in your life? So let's start with secure, right? And we saw this in the video. The child was exploring, they were playing freely when the caregiver was present. When the caregiver left, they were visibly upset. And when the caregiver returned, they were happy, they were relieved, and they were able to return to play. It happened pretty quickly that they were kind of able to return to this regulated state. And what's typically true about the caregiver is that they are able to provide appropriate soothing from distress. So they're able to comfort the child. They're able to provide appropriate room for the child to explore. And they mostly just represent safety for the child because they themselves likely feel safe. And by the way, I say this is typically true of the parent. In no way is this all the time true. So keep that in mind for all of these different styles that we're going to be talking about. And later on down the line, this is what secure attachment looks like. It's a person being able to self-soothe, so calm themselves from distress, a person who might be really comfortable reaching out to others, and somebody who's just confident, independent, and emotionally regulated. And so this is not to say that they don't get upset, but that they feel like they have options in their distress. So they can check in with themselves, or they can go towards others for help when they need to. We also have insecure attachment styles. So the first one we're going to look at is anxious. So we saw this in the video, right? We saw that the child was visibly distressed even when the parent came back, and that they were a little bit clingy, difficult to separate from their parent. But also you might have noticed that the child was a little bit hostile and ambivalent in that reunion, right? It wasn't immediately soothing, and in fact, it was kind of distressing still for the child. And so what's typically true about the caregiver in this scenario is that they are actually fairly adept at providing soothing from distress, but they might not be consistent with it. And also exploration is often discouraged by these types of parents. And that's not something that's ever explicitly stated. I mean, it might be, but typically it's an implicit message that's being sent through the parent's behavior. And this can sometimes be what we might call the helicopter parent, the parent who's always hovering over their child. But it could also be just a parent who is nervous and a bit insecure themselves. And so later on down the line, this looks like difficulty modulating emotional responses. So really high anxiety. It also looks like a preoccupation with being rejected or abandoned, which leads to this behavior that could be perceived as needy or demanding. But it's because they're feeling so overwhelmed. And if we want to think about what it's like to be in this kind of state, a metaphor we could use might be a flood. So feeling just so flooded by emotion that you feel like you have to take some action. And in my work, I work with a lot of folks who often feel this way. So just to share an example, one client of mine came to therapy feeling very stressed, particularly when it came to her work. And her kind of why did I do that issue was the fact that she was taking on so many extra projects at work, even though she had so little time to do so. And she certainly couldn't do them well. And what we found through discussing even more was that she was actually really terrified of disappointing her boss. She really respected her boss, and she would spend a lot of time ruminating about what her boss thought of her. And so that would be an example of perhaps somebody in an anxious state, where she's feeling really fearful on some level of being rejected by her boss, so much so that she engages in this behavior of just ruminating, and also this behavior of taking on extra projects. So that's anxious attachment. And now we have avoidant attachment. So you saw this in the video too. The child was kind of disengaged from their parent upon their return, right? That reunion wasn't so sweet. It was kind of low key and subdued. And these children are often labeled as easy or good babies. They don't put up much of a fuss, but we know that they're still experiencing some kind of distress, even though they might not be outwardly showing it. And here's what's typically true of this parent. They might have difficulty providing soothing when a child is distressed because they're really uncomfortable with strong expressions of negative emotion in particular. But they are often very encouraging of exploratory and independent behaviors. And what this looks like later on in life, actually, is that the individual might have high confidence, but it rings a little hollow. Because what they're actually doing is they're disengaging emotionally, and they might see very little purpose in investing in their relationships, and so they'll practice really high avoidance in situations that require them to be vulnerable, where they might get into a conflict or have to resolve something on an interpersonal level. And so our metaphor for the avoidantly attached person is just a still, deep ocean. So on the surface, as you're looking at this, it might seem like a calm and relaxed scene, but if you have watched any nature documentaries about the ocean, I recently watched one by David Attenborough where there's lots of kind of sea monsters, sharks, squids, underneath the ocean. You know that there's a lot of danger, a lot of activity beneath the surface, and that's what it can feel like to be avoidantly attached. And so in my work, I work with plenty of people who have this style too. And in the context of therapy, it can actually look a lot like clients who may have trouble knowing why they're even in therapy in the first place. So maybe someone encouraged them to go, but they feel fine, right? So as you start unraveling that, though, what you learn is that there is a lot going on that maybe has escaped their own awareness. They might not even be aware of what they're feeling. So that's what it can look like when someone is avoidantly attached. So let's just do a quick overview of these 3 attachment styles. Right, so on a very basic level, we're really looking at 2 important factors. Was the child typically appropriately soothed when they were distressed? And was the child able to explore? So we're seeing for secure, it's a yes, yes. For anxious attachment, it's a yes, no. And for avoidant attachment, it's a no, yes. And by the way, again, this is not it's not really that simple. This is a really reductive way of looking at this, but this can be a generally helpful way of thinking about it. However, in the strange situation protocol, they actually observed a different set of behaviors that they couldn't quite place within these categories. And so they refer to this as disorganized attachment. And so what's observed in this child is that some of them actually appeared by all accounts secure, but maybe they demonstrated these problematic nervous behaviors. They may have been so overwhelmed that they were unable to calm down from their distress. It felt nearly impossible. And there was just no roadmap of safety. And the reason for this is that typically these parents might be really unpredictable in their behaviors. They might have a trauma history, and they may themselves be threatening to the child in some way. So we know that when a child feels unsafe, they want to seek proximity to their attachment figure. What happens if the attachment figure is what is creating the threat? So you could see how this would create a lot of disorganization and a lot of dysregulation to that child's system. And one other thing to note is that this type of attachment style is also associated with traumatic loss. So perhaps there was a deep, secure attachment, but they lost their parent. And so that would be really earth-shattering. So later on down the line, what this looks like is the individual might use a combination of anxious and avoidant defenses. They might have difficulties regulating their emotion, difficulties self-soothing, and they might just be untrusting and suspicious of others. So our metaphor for this type might be being in the midst of a hurricane without any type of shelter or protection, so nothing feels safe. So an example of this from my work is I worked with a client whose father had been really emotionally abusive to him throughout his early life. And through our work together, my client started noticing this pattern in his romantic relationships where he would be so desperately wanting to connect with someone, but the minute they would get too close, he would retreat and he would isolate himself. And oftentimes he had a lot of difficulty trusting people's intentions in relationships. So that's kind of what disorganized attachment might look like in real life. And so that's our final attachment style. And with that, it's important to remember that no one lives in one style all of the time. Okay, we all have experiences of stepping out of security, stepping back into security. And that's why it can be really helpful to think of attachment on a spectrum. So this graphic comes from the creators of the Therapist Uncensored podcast, which I often recommend to clients and other therapists. It's really great. And on it, you'll see that all the way to the left, we have this blue state of avoidance. And all the way to the right, we have the red state, which is more of that anxious attachment. So you might actually often find yourself in that secure place, that green state that's right there in the middle. But perhaps you'll lean more towards the red or more towards the blue when you're under stress. So now that we've learned a little bit about what attachment styles are, you've maybe started to piece together what yours might be, which is really exciting. So let's take a look at what this means to you. Attachment is really important because you might be drawn to certain behaviors that are rooted in your attachment style when you perceive something as unsafe. So these are some examples of behaviors or strategies common along the attachment continuum. So you'll see for avoidant, we have disengaging from emotions, isolating, under-communicating. Anxious, we have reassurance seeking, over-communicating, feeling really flooded with emotion. That's typically how you might respond if you're anywhere on that end of the spectrum. So it's valuable to know that we can always fall into some of these patterns, right? You might be more avoidant one day in a certain situation, or you might be more secure another day. Important to think about these types of behaviors is because they represent some kind of difference in the way in which we perceive things differently. So in particular, we want to look at the way in which we encode things and the way we appraise things. So encoding refers to the social information that gets processed when we interact with other people. So in relationships, that's things like nonverbal cues, even your own emotional reactions. That's some really good information, right? And appraisal refers to the narratives that we construct around that information. So the stories that we tell about the things that we're encoding. And those with a more anxious attachment style tend to encode at a higher level. And that means that every word that's spoken, every small gesture, every feeling, nearly every piece of social information is getting picked up. And unfortunately, in their more anxious state, these same people, the anxiously attached, tend to make some negatively skewed appraisals. So an example of this might be, walking up to your partner who has kind of a flat expression on their face and assuming that they must be mad at you. Those on the more avoidant end of the spectrum have the complete opposite experience. So actually less information is coming in. So the appraisal is off, but in a different way. So an example of this might be that your partner comes home feeling upset about something and you are completely unable to discern that there is actually a problem. So that would be an example of really not being able to appraise because you're not getting that information. Beyond this though, another reason why attachment matters is because our attachment styles can interact with one another. So for example, I frequently work with couples that have opposite attachment styles. So one is more anxious, the other is more avoidant. And this is very common. And in the world of emotion-focused therapy, we actually call this a pursuer-withdrawer dynamic. So we're talking about a romantic relationship here, but this can exist in tons of relationships where one person is more anxiously attached, the other is more avoidantly attached, and when one moves towards the other feels threatened, one hyperactivates, the other deactivates, and so you could see where this would create sort of a cycle where both individuals are driven towards insecurity, and that sense of threat just stays, and in fact, it increases. So again, we're listing an example of a romantic relationship, but attachment can show up in several different types of relationships. And I actually recorded a video blog recently around this topic. So we're going to jump right into the middle of that, where I start to talk about what types of relationships are impacted. And I will catch you on the other side. Let's look at the specific kinds of relationships that are impacted by your attachment style. We often look at attachment through the lens of romantic relationships, and this makes a lot of sense because these are often very close relationships where there's enough safety for conflict to emerge. And attachment really shines in conflict, for better or for worse. But there are plenty of other places where your attachment style can show up, such as in close friendships. So an example of this might be that you feel really worried when you text a friend and they don't text you back. You might find yourself kind of ruminating, wondering if you did something wrong. That would be an example of anxious attachment. For avoidant attachment, an example might be that your friends often tell you that they feel like they don't really know you. You might feel like you're being as open as possible, but there's still something that feels inaccessible to your friends. Another place where attachment can show up is in the workplace. So an example of this for the anxiously attached might be that you received some negative feedback from your supervisor on a project you did, and you can't stop thinking about this feedback. You even check in with other people in your office to make sure that you're still a good employee, that you're still a good person. An example for an avoidantly attached person might be that you forget to ask for help on something that you really don't understand, because it's really not in your nature to seek out others, to ask for help. Another place where attachment can show up is in any relationship where there's some kind of power imbalance. So teachers, mentors, religious authorities, even your therapist, right? These are relationships that kind of resemble a parental relationship. So it makes sense that your attachment style will show up there. And on the subject of parental relationships, it's important to remember that your attachment style is still in play in your relationship with your parents, even though you're an adult. And this can feel very distressing to feel pulled back into that dynamic. So what's the good news in all of this? Well, understanding your attachment style can really help you in developing some self-compassion, especially at times when you behave in ways that really don't make sense to you. So instead of asking, why did I do that? You might instead start asking, how is this related to my attachment style? Really just start beating yourself up. Another reason why attachment is such good news is because it's flexible. You might have been oriented towards one end of the spectrum of attachment, but through new relationships and new experiences, lots and lots of practice, it's entirely possible to move towards that secure style of attachment. So instead of saying, why did I do that? You might instead say, how does my attachment style influence my behavior? Right? So that's a more compassionate question to start asking yourself, because you're realizing that it's really not your fault when you behave in these ways. It's not because you're a monster or because you're a coward. It's because you are responding to that blueprint, right? The blueprint that was made early in life that showed you how to orient yourself in relationships. So at this point, it seems as though it's finally time to ask yet another question. What is your attachment style? And how can you know? Well, one way to self-assess your attachment style is to think about the way you see yourself in relation to others. So for a securely attached person, that worldview tends to look something like this. So I usually feel okay, but when I need support, I'm confident you'll be there. Whereas for somebody on that kind of blue end of the spectrum might say, you might not be okay, but I'm okay. There's sort of that sense of confidence where maybe sometimes there shouldn't be. And for an anxiously attached person, the phrase might be, I'm okay as long as you are okay, or I'm not okay, but you can make me okay. So really a reliance on the other person to establish that regulation, that emotion regulation. And then finally, for the disorganized attachment style, that phrase is really, I'm not okay, but you're not okay either. Nothing feels safe. Right? So that's important to recognize. If any of these are resonating with you, if any of these sound like you a little bit, then it's possible that you tend to lean towards that attachment style. And actually, our poll question that you answered earlier could also be another great way to self-assess. So that poll question was, when problems arise in a relationship, what is the first thing you feel inclined to do? Option 1 was reach out to the other person to try to resolve things. By the way, 68% of you answered that. The second option was give the other person and yourself some space. That was 26% of you. And then move on from the relationship. 6% of you answered with that one. And the honest truth is that all of these could potentially represent secure behaviors, right? But you can imagine how reaching out to the other person in kind of an excessive way, right, seeking them out maybe in a really anxious way could represent that red style of attachment, where, giving the other person and yourself some space, also great, but if you do it so much so that you're isolating yourself, then that represents sort of more of an avoidant attachment style. And if you say you want to move on from the relationship, sometimes relationships need to end, right? That's okay. But if you do it to a degree where you're moving on from relationships without really engaging and from a deep sense of mistrust, then that would be an insecure, disorganized attachment style. And now that you've identified your attachment style, or I imagine you at least have some inclination of what that might be, you might be wondering what you're supposed to do with this information. So you'll see on this slide, I'm talking about earned security. All right, as I mentioned in the video we just watched, attachment styles are flexible. So there are definitely ways to move towards security in relationships, and we actually call this earned security. And earned security means moving towards that security through relationships despite your early life experiences. And this is made possible by neuroplasticity, which in its basic sense is your brain's way of rewiring itself. It's actually amazing. It's how we know that change is possible, is because of this thing called neuroplasticity. And earned security is so wonderful because it often comes with a deeper ability to self-reflect compared with those who actually start out with a secure base. So that's nothing against those who start out with a secure base, but this idea that you are able to move past that actually strengthens it, right? You've earned it. It's something where you have to practice it, and then you get better and better at more secure behaviors. So how can you earn security? Well, first, let's remember that attachment is actually a double-sided coin, all right? So your attachment may result in some negative behaviors, but it's important to remember that there are also really advantageous features of these insecure styles. So for anxious, for example, you are already great at assessing for threats. You know when something feels off, and you can really sense that. You're also great at having an awareness of the needs and the feelings of other people. You're really good at feeling your own feelings, right? You know when you're distressed. And what we want to figure out is how to gauge kind of the nuances of that distress. So here are your growth points. If you believe that you might be leaning towards that anxious end of the spectrum, here's what you want to be looking at. So one is question the narratives that your mind creates. So for example, is your friend not responding to a text because she's mad at you? Or is it possible that she's in a meeting and she's unable to respond at the moment? Right? So really questioning that. And another thing you can do is turn your attention inward. So anxiously attached individuals often seek external rather than internal validation. And that means that you're constantly trying to seek regulation from the other person. So instead, engage in practices that help you to understand your internal experience. So one great way to do this is through a process called mentalization. And that is simply noticing your feelings, noticing your thoughts. We did that at the beginning of this webinar, right? When I asked you to kind of check in with your body, notice what you were feeling, and also what thoughts were coming up for you. And ask yourself, what does this mean that I feel this way? And also, especially important for this style of attachment, what do I really want? Right? This is the style that will often defer to the needs of others or the opinions of others. Instead, really ask yourself, what do I want? And so an example of this, if you'll recall that client that I mentioned earlier who was constantly taking on projects and feeling really insecure in her relationship with her boss, what she started doing was she started noticing herself getting stuck in that narrative that her boss was disappointed in her. And she would start to question it. Right? So what she realized is that there was a lot of evidence to suggest that her boss actually really appreciated her. She'd gotten a raise just recently. She'd been trusted to do a lot of important work. So that evidence started becoming meaningful to her. And after a while, just changing that story started relieving that pressure to take on way too much. And she was able to be at work most of the time in a much more secure state. So that's anxiously attached. Let's look at avoidantly attached. Here's what you are already good at. You are already self-confident. You're already great at being independent. You're able to use these cognitive strategies, which is really important. And also you are able to emotionally suppress, which I know might sound like kind of not positive, but actually it can be a really useful defense in certain contexts. We can't always be feeling the depths of our feelings. There are certain situations where that's not fully appropriate to engage fully and deeply with our emotions. So you're able to not be flooded all the time. So here's what you do want to work on. You want to work on identifying opportunities to communicate your needs. You want to work on recognizing your feelings as valid, as well as the feelings of others. And you also want to reinvest in your relationships. So I'll share an example from my work. I worked with a pursuer withdrawer type couple a while back, and they would get into that cycle where one would seek the other out and often talk about problems in the relationship, and the other would sort of just shut down, which was, of course, really hurtful to the pursuer and created a lot of stress for both of them. So what we came up with was a kind of very structured strategy where every week they decided to set aside Sundays at 1 p.m. as an intentional sharing time. So this one time a week. And it was great for the withdrawer because she truly did want to hear from her partner, and she actually wanted to share with him too. But up until that point, it just felt really threatening. And actually, of course, it was great for the pursuer too, because he knew that he could look forward to having this conversation with her, to connecting with her, hearing from her. And she looked forward to it too, but she also knew she would only have to do it once in that very structured time, which brought a lot of relief to her. So that is avoidant. We have one more attachment style to go through, and that is the disorganized attachment style. And here's what you're already good at. You understand both ends of the spectrum. You know what it's like to be avoidant. You know what it's like to be anxious at times, and this increases your ability to empathize. You also naturally maybe have a healthy skepticism of others. Not everyone is to be trusted. There are times where it is maybe not a great idea to put your trust in someone, and you know that, right? You also have resilience, because likely to have gotten into this kind of attachment style where the roadmap is a little less certain, you must have been through some things, right? So we know that you've survived, and that's humongous. So here are your growth points. You are going to want to practice self-soothing and distress tolerance. So kind of sitting with intense emotions sometimes and not always feeling like you have to do something with them. You're also going to want to engage in mentalization. Mindfulness can also be really helpful for you. And establishing and recognizing safety. So you want to seek safety and notice that you're seeking it. And notice what it feels like to be safe. So wherever that is for you, even if it's something small, like going to a certain cafe that just really feels protective for some reason. And then finally, you also want to set boundaries with others so that they don't cross them, because that's at the end of the day, probably what you're most afraid of. So an example of this is the client I mentioned earlier with a history of emotional abuse. He really struggled to trust others in relationship, even though he desperately wanted to be in relationship. And this was a case where, honestly, the therapeutic process itself was actually really healing on its own. And I mean, if you think about it, it was such a risk for him to even be reaching out for help in the first place. And week to week, he had to grapple with this reality that I was someone who he could actually trust and someone who had good intentions for him. And over time, it became more and more natural for him to lean into that trust. And of course, that's the entire point of therapy, is to allow that trust that you develop with your therapist to then get translated to other relationships. And by the way, this is not to say that this only happens in the context of therapy. Any secure relationship can really have that restorative quality. So for those who use a disorganized attachment style, it can be so powerful to simply recognize when you are somewhere safe and when you've made the choice to be there, and also when you're with someone safe. So just really noticing that. So before closing out, I have a few things for us to keep in mind about all of this material. All right. So it's important to recognize your attachment-based interactions as a cycle, right? We want to name it to tame it. That's one of my favorite expressions, right? That this happens again and again because you have this blueprint in your life. But now that you know it, it likely will feel a little less intense, right? Because you've named it, you've called it what it is, all right? We also want to resist assigning a label of intention on the other person. And a few other things to consider about attachment. Again, there's no correct attachment style. So, security might be what you strive for, but to be securely attached to someone dangerous, that might be problematic, right? So this is why you've developed this attachment style. What is important is recognizing how you may be oriented in these relationships so that you can make empowered, appropriate choices moving forward. It's also important to remember that thinking only in terms of 4 rigid types of attachment can be a reductive way of seeing yourself and others, right? That's why we look at this on a continuum. You can fall into a secure place, you can fall into an avoidant place. It's often shifting. Another thing to remember is that while understanding your attachment experiences can result in less self-blame, the goal is not parent blame, all right? So remember that intent does not equal impact. The fact that you had this relationship with your parents does not mean that they're bad people, that they had bad intentions for you, but it does mean that the relationship you had did have an impact on you. So the idea here is not to blame your parents or yourselves. And then finally, earned security really involves a calculated risk. At some point, to work towards security, you're gonna have to do something that feels a little bit unsafe. And you're gonna have to know when it's time to take that step. So if you're avoidant, it could mean opening up about your feelings. If you're anxiously attached, it could mean checking in with yourself. And if you're disorganized, it can mean putting your trust in somebody. And that's risky, but it's worth it. So that's our presentation. We are going to open up the discussion right now for a Q&A. So I want to look at some of our questions right now. So let me pull those up. All right. So we have some really great questions. This is exciting. All right, so someone submitted this question. Is it true that women tend to have anxious attachment styles and men tend to have avoidant attachment styles? This is a great question. So today we've been talking about the attachment spectrum, right? And the importance of looking at things on a spectrum, right? And we want to do the same thing with gender, right? So there's no binary, yes, women behave this way, yes, men behave this way. That's important to remember. We do, though, want to think about how men and women are socialized differently, right? So men are often, or young boys are often encouraged to explore the world more. They're often discouraged to express their emotions, right? Where young girls often are not as encouraged to explore, but they're really encouraged in their emotional expression. So, while I'm not fully tapped into all of the research between the correlation of attachment and gender, what I'll say is it would not surprise me if there tended to be that tendency, right? But again, we're looking at this always on a spectrum. I work with plenty of clients who are women who tend to be more avoidantly attached. I work with plenty of clients who are men who tend to be more anxiously attached, and everyone falls on that spectrum in some place. So very good question. All right. All right, so what is happening in the brain for someone who is anxiously attached versus someone who is avoidantly attached? Another really great question. So one often not talked about part of your nervous system is this thing that you have called your vagus nerve. All right, so your vagus nerve has this really important functioning in your body. You might have heard of this. It operates with fight and flight and freeze mode, right? But another operation that it has is social engagement. So in fight and flight, we're really activated, we're really stressed, right? That sounds a little bit like somebody who's anxiously attached. In freeze mode, right? In that immobilized state, we tend to be kind of lethargic. We tend to feel a little bit numb, right? And this is all meant to protect us. Our body is going into these states to protect us. So of course, with fight and flight, that sounds a little bit more like anxious, and with freeze, that sounds a little bit more like avoidant. And with security, that represents that social engagement, right? So that's another aspect of your vagus nerve, is this ability to reach out to people, this part of your body that actually really does want to engage with other people. And that's what's happening for all of us when we're in those states. When you're more anxious, you're more activated. When you're more avoidant, you're more deactivated. And when you're more secure, you're able to reach out to others. So that's kind of the neurological differences that are occurring, or the neurobiological differences. All right. So another question we have, right, is this is giving me some great ideas about myself and my behavior, but how can I use these ideas to help other people see what they are doing? Now, I love this question. I sort of wonder if it was maybe written by somebody who tends towards the avoidant end of the spectrum, right? Because that voice is, you know, I'm okay, but you're not okay. And I can imagine, and this is not to criticize whoever sent in this question, it's a great question, but I can imagine that idea of just really wanting to point out to somebody else the ways in which they're not okay. And so first, I would recommend really checking in with yourself and knowing your own style first, and offering yourself that self-compassion so that you can offer it to others. Really, though, attachment is such an important thing for couples that I could see just educating your partner or your friend or whoever it is that you really want them to have these ideas, providing this education, because it can be such a relief to know that it is not your fault, right? And that's usually the tendency that's usually the operating principle that we have, right? That it's our fault. So attachment tells a different story. All right, another question. Is it possible to have a different attachment style depending on who you are interacting with? Yes, absolutely. As with anything on the subject of attachment, that spectrum really comes into play here too, right? So there are certain people who are going to activate you, certain people who are going to deactivate you, and this does not necessarily mean that you are that you have a disorganized attachment. That's sort of a different thing, but definitely you can have different responses to different people in your life. Absolutely. And this is a similar question. I see myself in a few of the attachment styles. Is it possible that there is a mixture? Yes, absolutely. And I think it can be kind of tempting to want to just lean one way and really claim one of the labels. That's why it's important to learn about every attachment style, right? Because this is not necessarily a trait. These are states that we fall into, right? So it's valuable to learn how how avoidance looks, right? Because we'll all practice avoidance. It's valuable to know what anxiety looks like, because we all at some point feel anxious. So yes, absolutely, there's potential for a mixture. With that, we will close out. I really do want to thank you so much for coming to today's webinar. We are, once again, my name is Christy. I'm a therapist at My Therapy NYC. We specialize in seeing individuals and couples, so do feel free to check out our website. We have tons of resources, including other webinars, other videos, blog posts, so you'll definitely want to check that out. And just so you know, anybody who's here will be sent a replay of this webinar along with some resources that I think you're going to really enjoy on the subject of attachment. So thank you so much once again, and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.